It's the 22nd of June 1941, and Germany storms into the Soviet Union expecting a lightning war, where they will overpower and shatter the Red Army. But a major shock to the Germans and their allies was the encounter of superior Soviet tanks, not just in numbers, but in armour and firepower as well. So how did the Axis powers overcome these tougher tanks? Some will shout superior German tactics, but actually there are other reasons this feat was achieved, and in this video we'll go over some of the lesser known facts. Now, the number of Soviet tanks in service at the start of Operation Barbarossa was 23,106, compared to the 3,500 that were coming in on the Axis side. But only a fraction of these were the superior Soviet tanks we're talking about. These are the KV-1s and T-34 series of tanks, and the numbers were as follows: KV-1 370 tanks, KV-2 134 tanks, and T-34s 895 tanks. These are the figures for the ones in active service, not including the ones that would arrive from factories over the next few months. Now this means we have a total of 1,101 tanks that are really out of the Germans' reach in terms of killing them easily. That's only 5% of the total tank force, and not all of these tanks were deployed near the front lines. Some would have took weeks to reach the battlefields. The Red Army was also not in a good state after the Winter War, which had gone pretty bad. Even with their victory, they sustained heavy losses and had lost a lot more equipment than expected, and the lessons learned didn't seem to get through to the army leadership as had been hoped. A major issue was the supply situation for tank forces, with a large amount of tank regiments having only between 5 and 10% of the required fuel, ammunition and spare parts. So straight off the bat these forces were criminally undersupplied. Now not all were undersupplied, but once the war kicked off and the Germans were pushing further into Russia, everyone was scrabbling for bombs, bullets and fuel. Shortages always happen, and with an existing issue this will only get worse. Now why were these units so undersupplied? Well, a mix of reasons. The main one was incompetence in the Soviet military, with officers being installed due to loyalty to the party over the actual ability to do the job. Corruption as well, with people skimming off the top and selling stuff. And then production shortages, with the fact that the Soviet Union just had the Winter War, which caused an increase in military supplies used, and production was at the lower levels until the Germans invaded, at which point the wartime economy kicked in and production ramped up to maximum levels. But it takes time to get those production numbers up. Also, we have supply spoilage. Things like petrol or diesel has a shelf life and must be stored correctly. Same for munitions and things such as engine parts and lubricants. If they're not looked after correctly, they will degrade and be useless. The next issue was the officers in the Red Army, with many who were put in the positions to lead the tank regiments had very little to no experience with armoured vehicles. They didn't understand the capabilities of the vehicles under their command. They had no idea of actual battlefield tactics and how best to use their tanks, and this was especially fatal as Germany had learned a lot about armoured warfare with their invasions of the European nations. The shortage of good officers was made worse with the fact that the Red Army had grown massively in the last few years, and military academies had lowered their standards to get enough men through to fill those positions. Then Stalin had conducted purges in the previous years. This had hit the military hard, with many seasoned officers with experience being removed or killed, and without those older guiding hands, it fell to new officers to manage an ever-increasing military that had to adapt to the new styles of warfare that were being introduced. Tank warfare on a large scale with high mobility was a new type of warfare entirely, and the Soviet Union had unfortunately laid a trap for itself, as with their latest war in Finland, the Winter War, tank tactics had proven lacking. Many officers had failed to learn the mistakes of using tanks in terrain not suited to these vehicles, and they lacked the use of combined arms, with many Russian tank forces being overly large and unsupported by enough mechanised or mobile troops to keep pace. So that when the Soviet tanks had battled with the Axis forces, many times they were alone. This allowed the Germans and their allies to exploit this lack of support, and this led to many a T-34 and KV being lost to close-range anti-tank weapons and anti-tank guns, which should have been spotted or neutralised if they had the accompanying infantry support, and by extension, artillery and air support. Another noted major tactical blunder was the fact that many officers in charge of T-34s and KV-1s didn't seem to be aware that their tanks were able to knock out the German tanks at far greater distances than their opponents could knock out their own tanks. So they ordered their armoured formations forward to engage at ranges that brought them into the effective penetration ranges of the German guns, such as the 5cm and even the 3.7cm if it was using armour-piercing composite rigid rounds on the weaker sides and rears of these Russian tanks. Also, they became vulnerable to the ranges of the 7.5cm high explosive anti-tank rounds, which had far shorter range than the standard armour-piercing rounds. If these officers had simply stayed at an effective range of their own weapons, there was little the Germans could have done unless they'd brought heavy weapons such as their 8.8cm guns to support them. But these took significant time to set up, and by then the Soviets would have been able to likely destroy them or retreat to safe distances. Now, I will say it's not all the officers' fault, as even with the superior weapons, the T-34 and KV-1 had a major flaw: very poor optics. Yes, they had great firepower, but not the equipment needed to land the shots accurately. The sights are only effective to around 500 metres, and these reports come from the crew members themselves. And if operating at slightly lower light levels, this was significantly reduced further. And the sights for the driver are also very poor, with certain foolish Russian senior officers advising the drivers to drive unbuttoned even when in combat. This means with the hatches open even if under fire to make sure they could see where they were going. This is obviously insane, as a single high explosive round of any calibre could, with the hatches open, kill the crew members or severely injure them, which would mean the tanks become very vulnerable to all sorts of weapons that it should not be, and I think most crews wisely ignored this advice. Primary glaring issue for the T-34 and KV-1 were the cramped turrets. This was far worse for the T-34 though, especially with the commander having to double up as the gunner. This meant both tanks had slow rates of fire due to the poor ergonomics. It was a mix of cramped conditions, inefficient ammunition storage which was easily accessible, overburdening the crews with too many tasks, and on top of it, lack of training for many of the tank crewmen, with even the ones who had sufficient training at tank schools lacked much experience in combat or training in war games. This means once the war began and they were thrust into high-stress combat situations, many crews bailed under fire. This was not always because of fear, it was simply not knowing what to do. One example I've read about was a T-34 which was hit but not penetrated, but the crew, not used to the loud sounds of being under fire, thought they had sustained damage and fled. And like I said, this isn't fear, it's thinking your tank is damaged or immobilised, so you do the logical thing of retreating to safety. It's the smart choice actually. One thing noted by German reports was the lack of coordination in T-34 and KV-1 forces, which should have, with superior firepower and armour, smashed through the German lines, but seemed to move around slowly and sluggish like a drunken man emerging from the pub. And a big factor in this was the lack of radios, with very few tanks having a radio, so commands could not be shared between the armoured forces, especially in the chaotic loud environments of battle, whereas the German tanks tended to have radios and they had learned how to effectively coordinate using these. The lack of radios also meant relaying important information, for instance, as if a tank forward of the main force spotted hidden AT guns or an ambush, by the time it had signalled the other tanks it was normally too late. Many tanks were lost to non-combat attrition, especially in the KV's case, as this was a big heavy tank weighing about 45 tonnes and in the KV-2's case 52 tonnes. This leads to it being overburdened, something that would affect the German Tiger tanks as well, and the KV's transmission was prone to braking, and with the Red Army in disarray, support vehicles strong enough to tow these to areas for proper repair were lacking, so many times these tanks would have to be abandoned, and then when the Germans advanced towards them, they would be destroyed by their crews to avoid them being captured and turned against the Soviet Union. This is something the Germans actually did with the KV-1, and we get the amazing KV-1B 756, which was the upgraded KV tank with the German Pak 40L43 main gun. It was also up-armoured and had many other minor modifications to improve the design. It really is a cool tank, so it's definitely worth a look. That's the KV-1B 756. The panicked response to the invasion also led to large amounts of Soviet forces being thrown at the Germans and their allies to buy time to set up proper defensive lines and mobilise the full might of the USSR. Unfortunately for the mighty KV-1 and T-34, this included themselves in these high-risk counterattacks, which had almost zero chance of any long-term success, but every hour they delayed the encroaching forces was worth the men and machines lost. As we all know, the Soviet Union could replace anything it lost as long as it had the time to do so. Also, at the start of the invasion, the majority of T-34s and KV-1s had been grouped into 4 regiments. This led to them being powerful on paper, but just as happened in the Winter War, these large formations were difficult to command effectively, and it also concentrated Russia's strongest armour, which is great for attacking, especially in breakthrough scenarios. But on the defensive, having these tanks distributed would have allowed for lighter forces, especially light infantry formations without much anti-tank weapons, the ability to repel and stop German forces dead in their tracks, with tanks that were nearly impenetrable to the invading forces. And we actually have an example of such a scenario. On the 14th of August 1941, during the German advance towards Leningrad, a remarkable defensive action occurred near Gachina. Lieutenant Kolobanov, commanding a small Soviet force of just 5 KV-1 heavy tanks, orchestrated a successful ambush against the German 8th Panzer Division. Kalbanov positioned his tanks near the village of Novy Uchkov, can't say it very well, apologies, utilising the terrain to their advantage. The only road in the area passed through swampy ground, creating a natural choke point. Kalabanov's tank, number 864, was concealed approximately 300 metres from a critical intersection, while the other tanks were strategically placed to cover potential enemy approaches. Each KV-1 was loaded with double the standard ammunition, with 2/3 being armour-piercing rounds. Kalabanov instructed his commanders to hold fire until his signal, aiming to mask the size of his force. As the German column advanced, Kalabanov's gunner, Andrei Uzov, destroyed the lead tank with the first shot. The Germans, initially believing they had hit a mine, halted, allowing Uzov to eliminate the second tank. Realising they were under attack but unable to locate the source, the Germans attempted to manoeuvre off-road, only to become bogged down in the swampy terrain. Kalabanov's tank then destroyed the trailing tank, trapping the column. In the ensuing half-hour battle, Kalabanov's tank accounted for 22 German tanks and 2 artillery pieces before exhausting its ammunition. Another KV-1 was brought into action, destroying an additional 21 tanks, bringing the total to 43 German tanks destroyed by a force of just 5 KV-1 tanks. So this obviously proves my point of, if they actually split these 4 powerful regiments of T-34s and KV-1s up into smaller, more manageable forces, they could have done a lot more damage to the invading German forces and potentially stopped them getting so far into Soviet Russia. As this shows, good officers and positioning of these tanks could cause massive casualties and equipment losses on the invading forces. And when we look at the tank losses for 1941 for both sides, we see 20,500 for the Soviets and 2,515 for the Germans and their allies. These losses include tanks and self-propelled guns, and not only combat kills but also losses due to attrition. And the ratio is 10-1 in favour of the Germans. It's a staggering failure for the Soviets in armoured warfare. And as we see from the previous tale of the success with the 5 KV-1s destroying 43 German tanks, it truly shows that it wasn't superior German tactics that allowed them to win the armoured warfare in 1941. Obviously this did help, but in my personal opinion it falls to the failures of the Soviet Union to train, prepare and use its armoured forces correctly. And if they'd actually done this, the Germans would have never got so deep into Soviet territory. So yes, the German forces were very successful, well trained, and they were a good fighting force, but it more falls on the Red Army, the Red Air Force, and obviously all the Soviet forces and their allies being unprepared and basically being in very poor condition. And if they'd been to a decent standard, World War II would have gone very differently. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it educational and useful. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, have a beautiful evening.